so this passage in Matthew chapter 16 has some stuff that's part of my favorite part of the whole New Testament, and it has some super controversial stuff, and it's the sort of passage that down through the ages people have tended to pick the part that they like and love it a lot and kind of not pay much attention to the rest of it. So the part that I like is verses 13 through 16. Those are my favorite verses in this passage because Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And this is the great question that is before all people. This is the great question. A long time ago, my brother confronted me and said, "I don't know what it is that you've been doing, and I don't know what you've been thinking, but I want to know what it is that's going on in your life." And so I shared the gospel with him. How did I share the gospel? I didn't tell him John 3:16. I took him to this passage. And I said, look, the fundamental question in life is, who do you say that he is? Jesus. Who do you say that he is? That's the question. That's the core question that you confront in your life, right there, boom. And so I love this part of this passage, right? And I have used this passage to share the gospel with a lot of people and to engage with a lot of people and to try to help people focus on, what am I doing in this life? But who do you say that I am? Of course, the part that immediately follows this, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind and whatever you loose. That, of course, is a passage that is critical in the life of the Roman Catholic Church. In the Roman Catholic Church's argument that it is uniquely among all Christian denominations, among all the churches around the world, that it is uniquely empowered, is based on the idea that the church at Rome has Peter as a bishop, as a critical leader, as a sort of founding person. That's not actually true. There's a church at Rome probably for at least 15 years before Peter gets there, and certainly a decade, and maybe more like 2 decades. But apostolic succession, Peter goes to Rome. Peter is martyred in Rome. Peter remains associated with the church in Rome down through the ages, and the bishops of Rome are successors to Peter. And so this passage is about, therefore, the power of the church at Rome. Or at least that's the way that's been interpreted. The interesting thing about that, to me, of course, is that the people who emphasize this part, verses 17 through 19, and put the focus on these particular verses, almost never continue and read verses 21 through 23, which, of course, are also about Peter, and where Jesus says to Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan." And Peter is on the heels. Peter makes a great confession. Peter is given this great commission, this great statement from Jesus, and then Peter is almost immediately rebuked by Jesus for totally misunderstanding and for totally being off the rails here about what he thinks is going on. "Get thee behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me." It's all the same passage. And so one of the challenges that we have as a church here is how do we understand these pieces together? And when we look at the history of the church, we see very little sense that people in the church have been very successful at looking at this whole passage and weaving these parts together. So I'm not going to spend time this morning really trying to accomplish that, but that's a fundamental challenge that we face as we think about this. And when we think about the history of the church, it's important to realize how much we in the church have struggled to put these pieces together and to understand how this scripture really works together. We've tended to pick and choose the parts that we like. And so the part that I like, of course, is, who do you say that I am? That's the part that I like. And so when I look in this passage, that's the part that I focus on. But the other parts matter too. And other people, of course, have consistently focused on other parts out of this. So next slide, I wanted to spend some time this morning on the invention and the rise of the papacy, the Pope at Rome. And as I've talked before, by the middle of the 3rd century, around 240, 250 AD, the Bishop of Alexandria is known as the Papa, the Pope. And it's more than 2 centuries later before the bishop at Rome becomes known as the Papa, the Pope. And the bishop at Alexandria, by the way, is still officially considered the Pope by those who follow the traditions that are aligned with the church at Alexandria. Because of church splits, there are multiple popes in Alexandria today, either 2 or 4, depending on how you do the counting. For the record, the 2 principal popes in Alexandria, popes of the church that are there, is Tawadros II and Theodore II. But there are actually 4 men today in Alexandria who claim to be the Pope, the Papa, and have authority over the churches that still fall under the Bishop of Alexandria, which includes, most of the churches through northeastern Africa and some churches of the East as well. The term Pope, Papa, doesn't become the official designation for the Bishop of Rome until the 11th century. But it's associated with the Bishop at Rome from maybe the 5th century on. But Alexandria has a much longer, much older claim to the use of that term. And in the 5th, 6th, 7th century, the patriarchs of the great sees, the great bishop seats of the church, basically Rome, Alexandria, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, all were called by people and their followers the Papa, at least part of the time. So that was a common term for a while. But today, most people, when they hear the term Pope, they think of the guy in Rome, the guy at the Vatican. But he is not the only person today as a leader in the church that still claims that term. So how is it that we ended up with the Bishop of Rome in this particularly significant position? As we talked about, when we talked about the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the collapse of the empire overrun by barbarians, or experiencing this great migration of immigrants, depending on how you want to think about that. But this left a situation where in the Western Roman Empire, and we talked about the geography previously. If you draw a line between the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, perhaps because Peter was martyred inside the city and Paul outside, but in St. Peter's Basilica, the basilica that was built by Constantine, those who built it believed that they were setting the point of the altar, the place that the communion would be served from, right over the grave of Peter. And there's archaeological evidence to support this, so that this was certainly their intent, and that they may have been successful in doing that. So the passage from Matthew 16, verse 18 in particular, is first cited by a bishop of Rome in the late 250s. Stephen is the Bishop of Rome between 254 and 257, and he cited that passage a couple of times in claiming authority over other bishops. He engaged in a correspondence with the bishop at Carthage and said, basically, we are in dispute on this matter, but I have authority over you, and it's because Matthew 16:18 says, Peter, and therefore I am the heir to this. But that's the first time, so that's 2 centuries on almost from when Peter is martyred. And Constantine's fingerprints are a little bit on this, because when Constantine is converted, he's converted before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Milvian Bridge, his victory, gives him possession of the city of Rome. And one of the great things, one of the early things that he did within a few weeks of that victory and gaining possession of the city of Rome, he began construction of a church to honor his victory, a church that is now called St. John Lateran. And that church is the official seat of the Bishop of Rome. St. Peter's Basilica is not actually the official seat of the Bishop of Rome. St. John Lateran is. And that church was built by Constantine originally as a memorial both of his conversion, but also of his victory and becoming the Roman Empire. And of course, Constantine also funded the first St. Peter's Basilica, the one that was replaced in the 1500s with the current St. Peter's, and the Church of St. Paul outside the walls, which is the church that was built at the place where it is believed that Paul was beheaded along the Ostian Way outside the walls of Rome. And this, of course, is because, Paul is a Roman citizen, so his execution lives under different rules than Peter's does. And so they're executed in different places by different means. We talked a little bit before about the idea of the pentarchy, 5 great centers of the church: Rome, Alexandria, Constantinople, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Jerusalem, of course, is kind of an honorary member of that group for most of the patristic era, because Jerusalem is besieged by the Romans twice, in 70 and then again in 135, and largely destroyed after 135 and significantly depopulated. And we go more than a century where Jews are banned from coming within sight of the city of Jerusalem. And the Romans actually changed the name of the city for a couple of centuries to make it seem like it's not a place that has any connection with Judaism. So Jerusalem is kind of one of the 5 great centers of the church in a sense of the history. But after the time of Constantine, particularly about 30 years after Constantine becomes about 25 years or so after he becomes the emperor, his mom, Helena, as an elderly woman, she doesn't make her trip to Jerusalem until she's pushing 80, which, in the patristic era is an uncommon age. Life expectancies, that's uncommon for somebody to be that old. And so a woman who is in her late 70s takes it upon herself to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and she seems to have been very active in that. There's a whole lot of tradition associated with that. She's the impetus behind the building of multiple churches in the ancient Holy Land that were funded by Constantine, including what's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a church that's built over the tomb of Jesus, the Church of the Nativity, which is built in Bethlehem over the site that is believed to have been where Jesus was born, and several other significant churches as well. David? Well, Constantine, of course, is rich because he's the emperor, and so he has, as the emperor, he's not limited. The president of the United States can't spend money unless the Congress says so. But the Roman emperor is not limited in that way. The Roman emperor, the treasury belongs to him. And so he used the Roman treasury, the money that the Roman government had, for the things that mattered to him. And so some emperors were fairly corrupt and used that money for personal benefit and for their families and stuff like that. But many emperors used the gigantic amount of money that the Roman government generated through its taxation to build things, the aqueducts, the tremendous public buildings. Most of that was built with money that came out of the Roman government's treasury. And most of these churches were built with money that came from Roman taxes. St. John Lateran, the original St. Peter's Basilica, those weren't built with money that was given by the people of the church. Those were built with money that came from the Roman government, at least originally. So Constantine, one of the things that's really important to think about when you think about Roman emperors is unlimited resources, financial and otherwise. We use the book that Marcus Aurelius, as emperor, wrote what are known today as the Meditations, which is sort of his personal journal. And so as the emperor of the Roman Empire, in the evenings, he sat down and wrote in a journal. And he wrote Stoic philosophy. He pondered, what does it really mean to do right? What is good, really? How would you know? And we use this because, okay, here's somebody who is unsupervised, who has unlimited resources, and what's he thinking about at night? He's thinking about trying to define what is right. What does it mean to do good? And that's pretty fundamental. And that should speak to us as believers about, it's easy to think, oh, if I only had a little bit more money, oh, if I only had a little bit more leverage in the world, oh, if I only had a little bit more whatever. Marcus Aurelius didn't need a little bit more. He had basically everything. And yet, he came face to face with, what does it mean to do right? What does it mean to do good? How do I know? And the fundamental questions that we face as well. So Constantine, leaves a big mark, but it's partly because he has giant money and he has huge authority. I say to a man, go, and he goes. And Constantine was in a position to say to 100,000 men, go, and they would go, or more. But in the patristic era, Rome, Alexandria, Constantinople as the city that Constantine founded. So Constantinople was treated particularly by Rome and Alexandria over the next centuries as sort of the new guy city, and the Bishop of Constantinople is always greeted as if he's kind of a latecomer to the party a little bit by those guys. But these five cities become the big important places in the church. And by the 5th century, there is some proposals floating around about we ought to formalize some organization of the church based on the bishops of these 5 cities being the 5 principal leaders of the church, and they ought to collaborate in some way and meet on some kind of regular basis. The Emperor Justinian formalizes that in the 6th century and imposes the stamp of the emperor on that idea. But by the 7th century, that whole idea is collapsed entirely. So it's a thing that never really got traction. And it fell prey not just to the Muslim invasions from the east, but also the political divisions between the Eastern and Western Empire, controversies between Antioch and Alexandria over theological and other issues between those, the bishops in those two places, and just the limitations of communication in the day. You know, people have to write letters. Council takes a long time to organize and get people to travel the distance. And along the way, the Bishop of Rome continues to be aggressive about asserting authority, which the others are very slow to honor or recognize, and for the most part actually reject. But because the bishops of Rome are pretty persistent in this, it gains a lot of traction over time. And part of this is because bishops in the West are becoming political leaders. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire leads to kingdoms, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, the Vandals, established kingdoms in parts of the old Western Roman Empire, but they're not strong kingdoms. There's a king and an army and not much structure. There's very little governors and local authority and actual government in these kingdoms, particularly by comparison with the Roman rule that preceded them. And as a result, people look to some local figure as the leader, as the person that we should turn to when difficult times come, when things don't work. There is no longer a governor to go to, and so people start turning to the bishop. The bishop is respected, the bishop is a local leader, so people start looking to the bishop to solve problems that are outside the church, because it doesn't seem like there's anybody else in authority around. There becomes a very great political vacuum in Italy. The last emperors in the West have relatively little authority. They have small armies. They have relatively little leverage. They moved the capital to Ravenna because Ravenna is fairly defensible, but that's because Ravenna is surrounded by swamps and Ravenna is difficult to get at, which also means that Ravenna doesn't have nearly as much influence across even just Italy, much less the rest of the Roman Empire. And so emperors become increasingly isolated and the bishops become the leaders in many places. And the Bishop of Rome becomes a hugely wealthy person because people who don't have children need to will their earthly belongings and their resources to somebody when they die. And it had become popular in the church into the patristic era to live a more ascetic lifestyle, to commit yourself to a monastic kind of a lifestyle. Increasingly, bishops didn't get married and didn't have children, and so many people died without having heirs. Many wealthy people and significant people, and so those people willed their property and their money to the church. And the church at Rome accumulated vast amounts of property, estates all through Italy, control over a significant amount of property in Sicily, and a very, very large amount of money. And so by the 6th century, the Bishop of Rome controls a vast amount of wealth. And you see the correspondence of the Bishop of Rome from the 6th century on is greatly concerned with managing all these properties. What are we growing on the farms here? What's the harvest like over there? How are these animals doing? When are we going to sell this? The economic part of the job becomes a very significant part of what the Bishop of Rome does. And eventually leads to people looking at the Bishop of Rome and thinking, I want that job. Because look at all the money that's sloshing around there. And this is why for the centuries across the Middle Ages and through the medieval era, the papacy becomes hugely corrupted because it becomes a very, very desirable job. And this becomes true for bishops through much of the West because there is so little government happening. Bishops have political control and access to gigantic wealth. And this is why you travel through Europe and there are places where you can still, Pauline and I visited Würzburg, and you can go see the bishop's palace, which is gigantic. And you know, it's better than most kings ever lived in. And it's a place where Napoleon famously rode up the main staircase on his horse. And it's partly because the main staircase is like 20 feet wide. And the stairs are very low, so it's kind of dramatic as a place to receive guests and to line up your soldiers and your pipers and, you know, up, down either side there. But the amount of money becomes gigantic here, and it's because people are giving because they don't have heirs. And we also have the challenge here, you know, the mass conversion of the invaders. In the late 5th century, the Franks have invaded northern France, what is now northern France, and established a kingdom there. And a guy named Clovis has become king of the Franks. And the local bishops arrange for Clovis to be married to a woman that they present as a princess of the Burgundian families which lived in that area before the Franks came, named Clotilda. And so he marries Clotilda as a way to kind of try to unify his kingdom. Clotilda is a Christian. And Clovis, having married her and having been victorious in battle several times around that time, attributes it to her God and becomes a Christian. And when Clovis becomes a Christian, Clovis makes an announcement to the rest of the people of the kingdom of the Franks, all the people of the larger tribe and the people that are under his authority, that all of you are now Christians too, because I am a Christian and you do what I do. And so you bring mass numbers of people into the church who know virtually nothing about the church, which becomes a real challenge for bishops and pastors and priests. But it also means that, you know, increasingly you got an illiterate church. The Roman system has started to break down. And so there's this huge focus on, you know, let's just do the communion service as a way to try to teach people fundamentals of the faith. Because the communion service walks people through the fundamentals of the faith. And so we'll do it the same way every week to emphasize this story so that people will get a hold of this story and they'll get it into their head. And of course, if you go to Roman Catholic Mass today, and you know, there's a number of other churches around the world and a number of other traditions that follow the same thing. It's the same every week because it tells the story every week. It gives you the fundamental story of the gospel and what we believe in that process every single time. And so this becomes a fundamental element of the worship. The problem with this, some of the problem with this, is it tends to make the congregation a little bit more observers than participants. You know, early church worship is very participatory, and this focus on the Eucharist is more passive, more people as audience. They're supposed to be students who are observing, who are listening, who are learning. But because of that, they are less focused on the actual engagement with this. So in 189 AD, a guy named Victor becomes the Bishop of Rome. He's the first Bishop of Rome who speaks Latin. Until 189 AD, all the bishops of Rome to that point are Greek speakers. And so to some extent, they're regarded by people in Rome as immigrants, as outsiders. Even though Greek is still the official language of the Roman Empire and is widely used in government and leadership, the local people had begun to speak Latin. Victor is a Latin speaker and was a very forceful and able guy. He is a huge driver of the early controversies about the date of Easter, and his argument eventually prevailed in the West. But he presented the Bishop of Rome as the guardian of the truth in the church. Victor argued very strongly that Rome preserved the true apostolic tradition, and that therefore there was a special gift of discernment that came from the church at Rome. And he believed that it was his singular vocation as the Bishop of Rome to embody the unity of the church. So more than a century on, after the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, the Council of Nicaea makes a decision about the divinity of Christ, which is fundamental to biblical orthodoxy today and to Trinitarian theology as we understand it. And then, very shortly thereafter, the emperor changes sides and most of the bishops change sides and go with the idea that that Jesus is the Son of God, is a creation of the Father, and is basically like an angel but more, and is not really part of the Godhead, that we believe in one God and Jesus is his Son and subordinate. And so, we spent some time with Athanasius, who was the man who stood against the world, against that. But the Bishop of Rome basically stayed with the Nicene position and kind of kept his head down for a long time and let Athanasius take the slings and arrows. But Rome remained in support of Nicaea when the whole church otherwise went the other direction. And so when the Cappadocians led the church back into agreement with Nicaea later in the 4th century, particularly at the Council at Constantinople in 381, you see that Rome has managed to stay on the winning side of every church council through the whole patristic era. And the Bishop of Rome has been a guy who almost never actually shows up at the church council. He sends legates, he sends representatives, he sends people to argue on his behalf. He often writes a lengthy treatise that he asks to be read at the council on his behalf. But the Bishop of Rome almost never shows up. Which means that his fingerprints aren't actually on it, and the Bishop of Rome begins to set himself up as, the council happens, and I make an input, I make an argument, I send representatives, and then I decide whether the actual output of the council is legitimate. And there's a council at Ephesus that it goes down through the ages as the robber council because of something that the Bishop of Rome said about it, but it was a council of great disorder, and the Bishop of Rome disavowed it from the beginning and wrote strongly against it as an illegitimate council, and it became known as an illegitimate council across the church, ultimately. So Rome continues to build more and more authority across the patristic era. They find themselves on the kind of the winning side. In 344, there's a council at a place called Sardica in what is now Bulgaria, and that council names Rome as the court of appeal for disputes between bishops. When there are disputes between bishops, the council at Sardica in 344 says that should be appealed to the bishop at Rome. Rome becomes seen as the judge. In the 5th century, the bishops of Rome begin to assert that Rome is not just the judge, Rome is the teacher of the whole church. And Rome is assisted in this by keeping better records than anybody else. And this is still basically true today. The church at Rome has an archive and records that go back very, very far. In the patristic era, it was Rome that kept an organized archive of what were the results of each of the church councils, what had been said at each of these places. The other churches, the other great centers of the church, were less effective at keeping a good list of what had already been done, and that meant that Rome became the source of the evolving system of canon law. So Damasus is the Bishop of Rome from 366 to 384. He's the guy that initiates the Latin translation of the Bible by Jerome, what becomes known as the Vulgate, which becomes the Bible of the West for the next 1,000 years. He came up with the idea, and his successor after his death initiated this. Beginning in 385, the Bishop of Rome issues a letter to the whole church, many copies made, and it's mailed out and sent out wherever they can, to the whole church, anywhere that they know of people, believers, they send it to them, addressing the issues and controversies of the day. And Rome begins to add these letters, these occasional letters from the Bishop of Rome to their body of canon law, to all the things that have been decided at the church councils. They start adding, and then the Bishop of Rome said, and then the Bishop of Rome said, kind of stuff. Leo becomes Bishop of Rome in 440 and is bishop for 21 years. He is known as Leo the Great. Two popes, two bishops of Rome are known as the Great. Leo is one of them, Leo the First. Between 440 and 461, he argues that the Pope is the judge of the church, and he's there to resolve disputes and affirm the councils. That is, when there's a church council, it's not official until the Bishop of Rome has affirmed it. And of course, he is coming to the position of the Bishop of Rome after Rome has been sacked by the Goths. And during the time that he is the Bishop of Rome, Rome is sacked again by the Vandals, and he becomes seen as the one reliable and respected leader, the one reliable and respected figure in the city. When Attila the Hun comes to Rome, it is Leo that goes out, and this is Leo on the left here. Leo is the guy that goes out to face Attila the Hun and convinces Attila not to sack the city. Leo identifies himself very closely with Peter, personally with Peter. Leo writes in ways that indicates that he thinks that he is the embodiment of the Apostle Peter, that Peter is speaking through him as the Bishop of Rome. He argues that Peter was the first to be ordained, that is, that Jesus called Peter first of the 12, and therefore Peter is the first to be ordained to the service of the church, and that therefore the Bishop of Rome embodies both Peter and his authority and that first ordination. He continues the Roman practice of not attending church councils, but sending representatives and then passing judgment on whatever it is that the council decides. His claims about the Church of Rome are rejected by all the churches in the East. The Council of Ephesus in 449 rejects Leo's argument, but Leo succeeds in branding that as an illegitimate council, and that has come down to us through the ages. But Leo is the guy to kind of invent the papacy. He's the first guy to claim the fundamentals of papal status and power. Now, in the picture here, the left-hand one, he's wearing a mitre cap. The mitre cap comes from the 11th century. It's something that comes out of the Byzantine court, and which spread across the church as a uniform for bishops, and the taller the cap, the more important the bishop. And so it's in the 11th or maybe the 12th century that the Bishop of Rome starts wearing a very tall mitre cap. The height of the cap intended to indicate that he is the greatest of the bishops because his cap is the tallest. Galatius is a little bit later here. Galatius is the Bishop of Rome from 492 to 496. He writes a letter to the emperor, a guy named Anastasius, who of course is at Constantinople, to instruct him on the limits of his authority as emperor. Anastasius is the emperor in Constantinople. Here's what Galatius, as the Bishop of Rome, wrote to him. There are two powers, august emperor, by which this world is chiefly ruled, namely, the sacred authority of the priests and the royal power. Of these, that of the priests is the more weighty, since they have to render an account in divine judgment even for the kings of men. You are also aware, dear son, that while you are permitted honorably to rule over humankind, yet in things divine you bow your head humbly before the leaders of the clergy and await from their hands the means of your salvation. In the reception and proper disposition of the heavenly mysteries, you recognize that you should be subordinate rather than superior to the religious order, and that in these matters you depend on their judgment rather than wish to force them to follow your will. So, now, he could write that because he was in Rome and the emperor was in Constantinople. The bishop at Constantinople couldn't write that kind of a letter to the emperor and expect to still be in his job the next day. Okay, or maybe even alive. So the emperor, the bishop of Constantinople, because the emperor is down the street, finds that he has to conform to the civil authority a lot. And emperors have their fingerprints on who becomes the bishop of Constantinople, and to a lesser extent at Antioch and Alexandria, because those remain under the control of the Eastern Empire. But Rome is under the Gothic kingdom after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Most of the Gothic kings are illiterate and don't know that much about what's going on, and they use Ravenna as their capital anyway. And so the bishop at Rome has power and is kind of free to write letters to rebuke the emperor and stuff like that, because there's nobody with an army nearby who cares enough to do something about what the Bishop of Rome says. Gregory the Great is the other guy here that I put up here. Gregory the First is the Pope, really the Pope at this point, from 590 to 604. These are the two guys who have been Pope that are known as the Great, officially. Okay? People use the term the Great about popes that they like. John Paul II is popular with many in the Catholic Church today. There are people that refer to him as John Paul the Great, but there's just two official popes that are the Great, Leo and Gregory. And they are the two guys who basically between them invented the papacy. Gregory pioneered the idea that the Pope is the teacher of the church. Gregory was the guy that established that the Pope would send encyclical letters on a regular basis to the whole church. That was something that had started after Leo, at least occasional. Gregory made it a regular thing. This is a regular thing, and there should be an annual letter or some regular letter on current topics and theological issues that comes from the Bishop of Rome. Gregory is actually the last kind of Roman Bishop of Rome. Gregory grew up in a family, senatorial class family. They were wealthy and influential going back several centuries. They had a great history. He was trained and educated as a Roman, as if he were going to serve in the Roman Senate or something. He was given language and other training that would support that sort of thing. But he's the last Bishop of Rome to really have a very classical worldview, to be trained in the classical era. and he's kind of the pivot between the classical era and the medieval era in Rome. A very gifted writer and administrator. When the Lombards came to conquer Italy and sweep out the Gothic kingdom, it was Gregory that headed the defense of the city of Rome. He asked for support from the emperor in Constantinople and got nothing. And this increased the authority of the Bishop of Rome because nobody else seemed to care. Gregory was committed to using the great property of the church for benevolent work, and he is the first pope in Rome to become a true temporal prince. That is, he became not just the default guy to ask, but he became formally the secular ruler, the sovereign ruler of Rome and the environs around that. And from the time of Gregory, at the end of the 6th century, until the 19th century, the Pope is the sovereign prince of central Italy, what becomes known as the Papal States. In 1870, the Pope ends up signing a treaty with the new government of Italy. Italy is finally unified, and he signs a treaty that limits his authority to what is now known as the Vatican City, but he remains a temporal prince, a secular ruler of that place. Vatican City is a sovereign political state. It is not part of Italy. It sends ambassadors, sits in the United Nations, has a foreign policy, all these things. That comes really from Gregory. He is the first of the popes to really truly be a secular prince, and that is true for every pope since then, down to 1870, or is a prince of a significant area, and since 1870, just of a small area. But nonetheless, Pope Francis today is also the prince of a small principality. So Gregory also began the idea that outreach missions work needs to be more organized, and we need to think about what we're doing and be more strategic about it. The church in what is now England, in Britannia under Rome, had been founded in the 1st century. As we talked about quite a while back, Simon the Zealot of the 12 may have been part of founding that church. But the church in Britannia faced disaster in the late 5th, early 6th centuries because it was a church of Celts, and the Celtic peoples of what is now England were driven out or killed by the invasion of the Angles and the Saxons. And the Angles and the Saxons were pagan peoples. And so the church in what is now England is swept away in those ages because the invaders kill or exile the Celtic peoples who are part of the church at that time. And so Gregory launches a new evangelistic campaign in what is now England. Evangelism to the Angles and the Saxons, who become, of course, the Anglo-Saxons later on. And he sends his lead missionary, he appoints as the bishop to the people of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of what is now England. And he becomes, as he establishes a church there, he becomes the archbishop of the then capital city of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Canterbury. And this is whence the Archbishop of Canterbury comes, who is, of course, today the head of the Church of England, the head of the Anglican Communion. So Gregory the Great is the guy who made that happen. So Gregory becomes the head of the Latin-speaking church and is able to ignore the emperor to some extent. The bishops in Constantinople could never do that. So he has a huge level of independence from temporal authority, and Gregory establishes the basis of the papacy for at least the next millennia. And this sets in motion issues that would drive the Reformation later on. The Pope's role as a secular ruler, the very limited accountability and oversight for the Pope, the increasing wealth and the opportunity for corruption that go with this, all these things that eventually become the basis of the Reformation are things that are set in motion at this time. So anyway, so those are a few things about the papacy. Next slide. A thing that goes with this is the growth of what we call canon law. Canon is a Greek term that means a straight measuring rod or a practical rule. The things that church councils decided from Nicaea in AD 325, when the first organized council happened after the Jerusalem Council in AD 50, the decisions that were made there were called canons. They were the straight lines by which people in the church could make decisions. And so every council from Nicaea on through the patristic era is a council where there was like one big thing typically that they were working on, but there was a whole list of other things. There were questions that came before the council, and they made decisions, and they issued some paper that's at the end that said, these are the decisions that we made, and they listed them as numerical. You know, Canon 1, we decided this about this thing. Canon 2, we decided this about that thing. And most of these councils decided, 30, 40, 50 things as more minor and peripheral elements along the way. And this canon, the use of this term canon, made it a distinctly church thing. Laws in the Roman world were leges, a word from which we get legislature today, but the laws of the secular state were leges, and the laws of the church were canons. And so these are compiled over time. The point, of course, was that every time there was a church council, they were adding to the list rather than going back to the beginning. And so Rome grew in authority and influence because Rome was the best church at keeping a record of what had happened at all the previous councils and what has previously been decided. Because if something has previously been decided, then we shouldn't need to decide it again. We should just use the precedent and follow that. And so that's a fundamental of canon law, as it is in our legal system today, which grows to some extent out of that, the idea that precedent matters, that if this has been decided before, we should make the same decision now. We shouldn't go back and start from scratch. So the bishops then are focused when they assemble on only questions that haven't been previously decided. So that creates consistency, and it allows you to get deeper into each of these questions every time you come back and revisit them, because we already decided this, so let's think about the next level of implication here. And that helps to deal with an increasingly complex world. And these decisions, the canons that were made at many church councils, doctrinal, moral, but some were organizational, instructional, and functional about how the church runs. And they became the basis of a whole lot of ecclesiology. What is it that we think about how the church works and how the church runs? So the decisions of church councils were the basis of canon law, but other things get added along the way, opinions of important figures in the church, and the bishop at Rome in the latter patristic era and the early Middle Ages consistently asserts the authority to write things that will also become part of the canon, to make kind of unilateral decisions and add that. But this is the idea that there should be a core of guidance for things that are not directly addressed in the Bible. And it's really kind of the first legal system of the Western world. And some argue that the canon law system that you see in the Roman Catholic Church and some other churches today is really the oldest functioning legal system in the world, the oldest one that is still operating. And the Roman Catholic Church, of course, is the most famous for focusing on canon law and accumulating a great body of canon law. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church in recent decades has kind of wandered away from much of that. The idea, of course, of this is that you remain on the same path. When you start to do something really different, you're outside the bounds of the concept. The concept is that this was decided, that the things that happened at Nicaea and the decisions that were made in AD 325, that we still do stuff that builds on that. We don't ignore that and set that aside. We build from that. And in the modern era, there's less appreciation for that. But canon law has spawned a system that there's a code, there's lawyers and experts, there's a court system of sort. There are people that function as judges, which were bishops in the patristic era. The group of bishops, sometimes a single bishop, was the judge of a case, and sometimes a group of 3 bishops, and some big, really difficult things were given to the whole group of bishops at a church council. But there's a system of punishments that goes with this. What do we do with people who violate these things and who do evil in the church? Evolving principles for legal interpretation. So all the fundamentals of a real legal system. But this is a system, our modern American legal system is adversarial. I get a lawyer, you get a lawyer, and we fight, basically. We fight formally. But each one of us has a lawyer who is acting on our behalf, and the 2 lawyers are in an adversarial thing. There's a winning and there's a losing. That ecclesiastical system here that comes out of canon law is not supposed to be adversarial. It's supposed to be inquisitorial. That is, it's supposed to be everybody involved is in search of the truth. Everybody's involved is in search of what is the real truth, what is the big idea here. And of course, from this inquisitorial thing, we got later on, church uses the term inquisition, pursuit of the truth, which has a really bad odor because of abuses that are associated with that. But it is about the idea of the pursuit of the truth. How do we find the truth? And the idea that that is the point. Find that which is true. And where a system where all the parties should be committed to the pursuit of the truth. But the growth of the system of canon law also becomes a thing that influences the rising authority of the church at Rome, because the church at Rome is the church that is most committed to keeping records and to building the canonical list. And Rome was pretty good. Most of the Roman bishops were good at ensuring that Rome's official list of all the decisions didn't include stuff that Rome disagreed with. So the list that the Roman bishop kept was filtered a little bit, because when the Roman bishop disagreed with decisions, the Roman bishop said these are illegitimate and mostly didn't include those on the list. And so the list that people ended up referring to was a list that had been filtered by the Roman bishop. And so this is one of the reasons that Rome came to have the greatest influence in establishing the law. And so you still see today the Roman Catholic Church, it's a very strong system of canon law, the Anglican Communion, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the churches that align with Alexandria, the Syriac churches, Armenian churches, and the Byzantine, the churches that come out of the Byzantine heritage of Constantinople, all these still keep and adhere to codes of canon law. In Presbyterian and Reformed churches, we don't believe in this long system of canon law in that highly organized way, but we still talk about practice and procedure. We talk about church order. We talk about things that allow us to engage with one another in orderly way as we think about governing the church and providing discipline within the church and how we worship and what we do. And so we still routinely rely on precedent, which is basically the basis of canon law. Let's go one more slide. I want you to look at these images. These images, 3 of them are from Roman catacombs. One of them is from a church in Ravenna in Italy, and one of them is a sculpture that is from a basilica south of Rome. All these are from the patristic era. All these images. What do they have in common? Same pose. This is called the orans. So, which is a Latin word that means praying. Now, the one in the bottom center is actually Livia, the 4th wife of Augustus Caesar. She's a pagan. And so this is a pose that pagans use for prayer, but all these other 4 are Christians. And in the patristic era, this was the pose that Christians commonly associated with prayer. That this is the bodily attitude. Mostly people prayed standing with kind of their elbows in and their hands open and out to the side. There are people that believe that this is representative of crucifixion, that this speaks to that. Numerous biblical figures in the Catacombs of Rome are presented in this way. For people that are not specific historic figures in the catacombs, these figures are almost always female. So there's a feeling, the Catacombs of Rome tell us a story that in the early church there's a strong sense that women who pray matter, that women who pray are significant in the church, and that in life and in death, I want there to be some women who are praying for me, that this is necessary for me. But this is a symbol in a picture that is very indicative of worship in the patristic era. What did people look like when they came to worship? What did people do when they came to worship? And of course, this has become sort of famous again in recent decades because Pentecostal churches and charismatic kinds of churches are very fond of doing this sort of thing today. But it's still part of the liturgy in Eastern Orthodox, in some Anglican and Lutheran liturgies that haven't been modernized significantly. In the Roman Catholic Church today, this is a pose that is actually reserved for the bishop and to some extent the priest when the priest is doing certain kinds of things. So this is a pose that in the Roman Catholic Church the lay people are not supposed to use. It's supposed to be a sign of authority, and individuals should use this posture in the Roman Catholic tradition only when they're praying privately, when they're alone, but not publicly. Because publicly it should be used by those who are leading the prayer, not those who are participating in it. But this is a very common worship pose and worship perspective from the very early times of the church, the patristic era. the earliest Christian catacombs that we have around Rome, this image is repeated again and again and again and again. And so it's part of our heritage as the people of God. So we have the challenges to remember what it is that has come before us, to remember those who have come before us. We have the challenges of thinking about administering the church and thinking about how should we then live? How should we then live together? And what does that mean? And we have things that we can think on and things that we can look back to as we consider these things as we are the church today. And so next time I want to spend some time talking about why paganism went away and why the people that are pagans today are not pagans in the classical tradition. So anyway, hope to see you again next time. Lord, we thank you for this time. We thank you for those that have come before us, for the faithful who have raised their hands in prayer, who have gathered as your people, who have rejoiced to know you.